There's this fun game that religious people like to play sometimes. And of course, by fun, I mean terrible. Because the game goes like this. Some awful thing happens, some tragedy happens, some disaster far away, and we religious folks have a way of saying when it's somewhere else, well, clearly, that's God's judgment on those people, especially if we've invented a reason why those people in that place far away are so terrible, godless, wicked. This must be God's judgment on them. And after every hurricane or earthquake or flood, you'll find the airwaves and the internet flooded with respectable religious talking heads insisting they know who God is zapping and that their wickedness is now yielding just deserts in the way that punishment is coming. And at the same time, the way this respectable religious game goes, anytime there's something terrible that happens close to home, well, that's a tragedy. That's something that requires us to all band together and help and support those who are hurting. Far away, that's clearly God's judgment. Close to home, well, that's different. Funny how easily the rules get bent when it's somewhere in my backyard, and how we imagine judgment and fire and brimstone and God's wrath when it's somewhere else, especially somebody I've identified as worthy, I think, of God's judgment. What does Jesus think about all this? I mean, it sounds so convenient a theology that you can understand why people would be drawn to it. It sounds so simple. It's sort of basically dressing up karma in the language of God, right? Bad thing happens, that's God's judgment. Good thing happens, that's God's reward. It's a neat and tidy way of seeing how the world works. The trouble is, it's the opposite of what Jesus teaches. It's the opposite view of how Jesus sees the world. And if Jesus matters to you, then we're going to have to dramatically revise our old thinking that when a terrible thing happens far away, that's God's judgment on them. And when a terrible thing happens nearby, that must be a tragedy that is to be avoided or where God will help us get through it. But it's us poor victims here and those, wicked, godless people over there. I mention all this because this coming Sunday, as we get ready for the third Sunday in Lent, we're going to hear a scene where Jesus takes on this kind of bad theology, this kind of religious conventional wisdom that keeps showing up over the generations and across the centuries. It starts out where some people come to Jesus to get his opinion on clearly what was sort of a headline of the day. Jesus, did you hear about those Galileans that Pilate, and their phrase for it, mingled their blood with their sacrifices? This is a strange way of saying that Pontius Pilate, the Roman governor, killed them while they were in the act of offering their sacrifices. And Jesus' response is, well, hold your horses. The way you're asking me, it sounds like you're thinking these people are getting God's judgment, that Pontius Pilate killed them as a noble and righteous arm of God's vengeance. And Jesus says, no. But how about this? How about you worry about you? And how about you take care of whatever stuff in your life you've got to get your act together on so that you don't end up in some sort of tragedy? Jesus doesn't say God sent Pilate to kill those Galileans, but to say, don't assume that they're any worse sinners than anybody else. Don't you try and connect the dots that when a bad thing happened to them, those people, those Galileans, that must have been God's wrath on them. And then Jesus sort of turns tables and goes, you remember that other news story about when the Tower of Siloam fell on those people in Jerusalem? You think they were any worse sinners than anybody else? No, that's not how it works. It's funny how when it's a story that hits close to home, right? A lot of the folks who are coming to Jesus are coming up from Jerusalem around Judea, and Jesus offers a story back at them. Well, what about what a tragedy that happened in your neck of the woods? Is that God's judgment on those people? Oh, no, I don't want to consider that. This is the thing. The moment we accept a theology that says when bad things happen, it's God's zapping somebody, it's going to hit pretty close to home at some point. It's going to be me and somebody in my circle pretty soon. And I'm prepared to decide that when a bad thing happens to me, that must be God's judgment on me. Jesus says, no, don't connect those dots. That's not how it works. See, underneath all of this thinking, all the people who are coming to Jesus, whether it's about Pontius Pilate and the Galileans or the people the tower fell on top of, all of them tend to assume that everything that happens that's labeled as bad, that must be God's zapping disapproval on somebody. In other words, that when someone is suffering, that must mean God is punishing somebody's sin. And Jesus just dismantles that whole notion. This is really, really important, especially in this season that we call Lent, because we're being pointed toward the cross of Jesus, where Christians are convinced that God is revealed in suffering love, that the cross isn't a matter of Jesus did something wrong and is getting zapped by God, but rather God's unwavering, unrelenting love is willing to absorb all the worst that human beings can do, even to the point of a cross. In other words, that the cross isn't about Jesus having sinned and therefore needing to get zapped, any more than when something bad happens in your life, when there's a diagnosis, or you lose your job, or the market tanks, or you break your leg, or whatever things might happen. Man, is it easy for us to slide into thinking this must be God punishing me for something I did wrong. And Jesus' response is, that's not how it works. In fact, we dare to believe that we see God most clearly, in fact, in the midst of suffering, even bleeding out and dying on a cross. At the heart of the Christian faith is this scandalous and yet beautiful idea that where we most clearly see God is exactly where we don't expect a respectable God to be. There, between thieves, dying on a cross. And once we learn to recognize God there, once we recognize that the suffering of Jesus isn't that Jesus is getting zapped because of God's wrath, but that he is there embodying God's love, once we're clear on that, the same way Jesus is clear, then all of a sudden it dismantles the way we are so quick to point fingers at when a bad thing happens to those people over there. Yeah, that must be God's judgment. And maybe to see mercy everywhere. Maybe to see a love that flows across borders and boundaries so that we don't think that people far away, those are the bad people, and the people nearby, well, those are good people. But maybe all of us are in desperate need of mercy where we are. A mercy that meets us, in the midst of our suffering. That meets us, when tragedy happens. We're going to wrestle with those kinds of things this coming Sunday, and we hope you'll join us for that conversation. Join us this Sunday, on the third Sunday in Lent, as we discover a God who meets us in all those unexpected places. See you Sunday.